So, in yesterday's video, I discussed various possibilities for what they could do with Roman Reigns. And as I was making the video, the news became public that, yes, indeed, WWE was sold. I did a video last year discussing the rumored WWE sale that had been going on since 2021. And really, the sale had been a thing that Vince McMahon had thought about going back to 2019 ish. Now, the sale actually went through over the weekend, or at least the paperwork was being filed and everything. I mean, I think it's still in progress of actually happening. It's still a procedure. But I noticed that there's a lot of confusion amongst the wrestling fandom. And of course, much like with anime and the stuff I cover in the main channel, there's going to be a lot of misinformation out there. So I'm going to give my thoughts not only on the sale, but I'm going to give my thoughts and explain to you like what's actually going on. And again, also tell you what I think is going on. Number one, it's a very big story. This is the first time in 70 years that this company has been owned by somebody not in the McMahon family. Going all the way back to Jess McMahon when it was Capital Wrestling Corporation, then it became Worldwide Wrestling Federation, then World Wrestling Federation, then of course World Wrestling Entertainment. This company has spanned generations within this family and is finally being sold. Now, if you're wondering why Vince chose to sell the company as opposed to handing it down to Stephanie and her daughters or Shane and his kids, because I've seen some people speculate this and ask why. The reality is, guys, that we're not a part of this family. People think they know people on television. You really don't. For all intents and purposes, they could have had a family meeting, Vince, Shane, Stephanie, the kids, everybody, and said, do you want to continue to run this thing under our family, or do you want to sell it like what the UFC did, like what other companies are doing, to a bigger entity, work under it, and then take the money and sort of create this generational wealth? You could even argue that they already have generational wealth. And the reality is that maybe Triple H and Stephanie's daughters and Shane's kids didn't want to own it. I mean, you got to think about this. You know, some of you out there have kids and some of you want your kids to follow in your footsteps. But if they don't want to own it, if they don't want to even have a passion for that business, what are you going to do? You got to sell. And for all we know, that could have been what happened. As of right now, last night's Raw was not very good. All right, and I'm starting off with that by saying this. There's no question that it felt like last night's Raw had Vince McMahon's fingerprints all over it. There's already reports that he was changing stuff last minute. And boy, oh boy, if we're going to go back to that, well, we had a good run, didn't we? But as far as we know, Triple H is still head of creative. And Vince has a higher creative role than Triple H. But as far as based on the interviews that I was reading and things that Vince said, there's about a 20-minute interview with CNBC with both Emanuel and Vince McMahon with his freaking dastardly mustache discussing these types of things. Not so much in detail, but he's not going to really get into the minutia of the creative based on what we have heard, although he is a guy who likes to have a lot of control, but he does have power over the executives in WWE. And we're going to break down that corporate structure right now and keep it as simple as possible. So one of the big confusing points that people have been hearing about all weekend is this idea of UFC and WWE merging. Okay, now I am not an attorney for mergers and acquisitions. That's not my specialty. I'm not a lawyer. If you're out there and you are a lawyer in mergers and acquisitions, please leave a comment down below if you happen to have that, that kind of savvy to give us more context on this. But I do understand corporations and businesses and how this is going to work. So I'm going to explain it to y'all because a lot of articles said merger, and I think people are thinking that WWE and UFC are going to be the same company, and that's not what's going to happen. They are under the same company, but they are not the same company. So I would not expect to see John Jones having, scripted wrestling matches with Roman Reigns. I don't think that's happening anytime soon. I could see Daniel Cormier, making cameos like he already did. I could see WWE guys putting promos on UFC pay-per-views. They may muddle the waters in that sense, but that's not what's going to happen. I'm going to tell you what I think here in a minute. First of all, I want to say this. I'm glad it wasn't the Saudis. Nothing against anybody who's Saudi Arabian, but having this company owned by a foreign entity opens up a lot of possible problems with this country and with the future of the creative, because when you're under a country that has such unique rules like Saudi Arabia does, the whole product could have a drastic turn and not for the better. So I'm glad it was actually bought by Emanuel, who has experience with running fight companies like the UFC. He doesn't run the day-to-day, but he owns it. Now, we're going to go into all that here in a minute, but I wanted to say that I'm actually glad that it was Endeavor that bought it, as opposed to Disney or the Saudis. And the company in Endeavor's hands is as good as it's going to get, because they've certainly taken UFC and they've increased it. And I know some of you guys have questions like, you're asking, does this mean we're going to get WWE pay-per-views back and that the Peacock deal's over? Not as far as we know. Right now, it's still in the process of everything transitioning over and the power transfer being, a thing. But I would not assume anything. As far as we know, everything on that front is going to stay the same. WWE Network and WWE on Peacock is not really going to change. The day-to-day operations won't change, at least not yet, until this actually all gets organized. So let's go ahead and get into the corporate structure here. Now, again, a lot of articles were saying merger, and that's not what this is. This is an acquisition. And mergers and acquisitions both are sort of in the same olive branch, but they're different. Let's go ahead and get into this. So I wrote this up yesterday. So here's how it's going to work. So Endeavor is the parent company. CEO Emanuel. He's the guy who, if you've ever seen that show Entourage, it's loosely based on his life. So Emanuel is, well, at least aspects of it. Emanuel's the top dog. And he's also an agent. He's had a long history of Hollywood. They also own some bullfighting companies. They also own, I think they own some like beauty pageant stuff. And they own some an agenting company, an agency. So what's going to happen is right below Emanuel, we have this new unnamed company. Now, this company, as of right now, does not have a name. Right? This company will be put on the New York Stock Exchange as a subsidiary of Endeavor. So you have Endeavor at the top, and underneath Endeavor, you're going to have this new company. Again, as of right now, that company has no name. Mark Shapiro. Yes, the same Mark Shapiro who worked on Dick Clark Productions. He's a big Hollywood guy, big television guy. He will be one of the powers that be, along with Vince McMahon, who is now executive chairman. Now, this is interesting, very interesting, because this purchase puts Vince McMahon perhaps even more powerful than he was when he owned WWE. Here's the thing. Vince McMahon and Mark Shapiro have to answer to Emanuel. He's the boss. What he says goes. On the CNBC interview, they said that, well, we have a disagreement, we just won't do it, etc., but they're going to work together. There's a lot of respect. There's a lot of mutual respect between Vince McMahon and Emanuel. And this is the first time in, good Lord, since like 1982, 81, that Vince has ever worked for somebody else. And the person he used to work for was his own father. Now, you have to understand, he's working under Emanuel. That does not mean that he's going to necessarily be handcuffed to what he can do. He just has to convince Emanuel that it's the right move for business. So the way it's going to work is Vince McMahon, executive chairman, Mark Shapiro's the president, and this new company will be put on the New York Stock Exchange probably sometime this year. And within that company, you have UFC and WWE. UFC president will remain to be Dana White, who had minority ownership in the UFC. I think he owned like 7%, 10%, something like that. Then we have Nick Khan over on the WWE side. So, yes, Dana White, his boss, one of his bosses is Vince McMahon. I know that drives some people nuts, especially some MMA fans, but it is what it is. When Endeavor bought the UFC, Dana White always had to answer to the Fertittas. When Endeavor bought UFC, his only real boss was Ari Emanuel and some other shareholders. Well, now he's got to answer to Vince and Mark Shapiro. Now, it doesn't mean that Vince is going to tell Dana White to give UFC characters or UFC fighters characters and gimmicks, although sometimes they really need it. It doesn't mean that we're going to have Vince McMahon showing up on UFC television, cutting promos. Don't expect that to happen because I think people are so uneducated when it comes to this. The UFC and WWE are not merging in the sense of they're not becoming one company. They will be a subsidiary of Endeavor. There's the pyramid right there. So UFC and WWE will still be separate operations, although there probably will be some cuts. I can imagine some front office employees might get cut. They're going to obviously move the offices somewhere else. People are going to lose their jobs over this. This happens a lot with mergers and acquisitions. This is a very common thing that happens. It's unfortunate, but it is what it is. So because of that, they may cut down on equipment. They may use the same cameras, things of that nature. Probably not identically the same, but I could see there being some changes in the corporate structure. But UFC and WWE will still be separate. This new company, which was referred to as a sports and entertainment firm, not sports entertainment, sports and entertainment firm, is under the control of Mark Shapiro and Vince McMahon. Now, what do I think this means? Does it mean we're going to have Conor McGregor showing up on Raw? No, I don't think it's going to happen, at least not in the way people think. I think there's going to be a brand new synergy between WWE and UFC. And I think something people have to understand who don't really know the history of MMA and the history of especially Vale Tudo in Japan is that WWE and UFC are actually pretty similar as far as they're both there to promote fights. The only difference is that one is predetermined and one is real. And there obviously have been some worked MMA fights, not in the UFC, but in places like Japan. We could talk about that another day. But because of athletic commissions, don't listen to anybody who says, well, UFC fights are going to be fake now. They're freaking morons. They're stupid. They're idiots. I have to accept the fact that 50% of people are morons. 50% of the population are freaking morons. And hopefully you guys are on the right side of that percentage. No, it does not mean we're going to have fake UFC fights. And it doesn't mean that WWE matches are going to be real. There are two separate entities under this new sports and entertainment firm, which will control both of them. What I think we will see is I think we are going to see UFC promoting WWE pay-per-views and vice versa. So if there's a weekend coming up where there's a big UFC fight, don't be surprised if you have a promo on the show for the next WWE pay-per-view on Peacock and vice versa. If, International Fight Week is in July, Money in the Bank is right after, expect a Money in the Bank package to air on the UFC pay-per-view. Things like that. You're going to get things like that. You may get Joe Rogan interviewing, Roman Reigns to promote a WWE pay-per-view. You may get Daniel Cormier to interview, a WWE guy. You might get, who knows, man. You might get like some UFC guys in the front row of WWE shows. You may get things like that. But you're not going to have them. There ain't going to be no pay-per-view where they have UFC shoot fights and WWE worked matches. You're not going to see that. Even though that kind of stuff is regularly happening in Japan, or at least it used to when you had K1 having like worked worked wrestling matches on the same card as shoot kickboxing fights. Yes, folks, in Japan there are shows that have both real and fake matches on them. I'm not making that up. That's Japan though. In the United States, because of the unified rules and because of the athletic commissions, you're just not going to see that. It'd be cool, but you're just not going to see that. The idea is Vince and Mark Shapiro are going to run both companies, not the day-to-day operations. That's what Dana White and Nick Khan do, but they're going to be the ones to oversee synergy decisions. They're going to be the ones to oversee marketing decisions. They're going to see where the money's going to go, the pay, all that stuff. All that big stuff, the big picture stuff with the two companies, that's what Vince and Mark Shapiro will do. So in many ways, Vince made himself more powerful than he even was before, because now he has some power, although not as much as people think. He does have some power over the UFC. So I wouldn't be surprised if you see like UFC doing different types of branding. Maybe their merchandising will go up. Maybe we'll get more UFC merchandise. We might get more UFC type of like, you know, like more like a pro wrestling type of thing where you get more like shop deals and things like that. Because WWE's real good with merchandise. Real good. Maybe we'll see UFC do stadium shows, but they're probably not going to change that much. So that's the story. I think it's crazy, but I'd rather it be Endeavor than Disney or the Saudis, so I can't really be too upset. The only thing I'm worried about is it going to make Raw? Is Vince going to be doing the minutia of Raw? He claims he's not, but last Monday's Raw, the one from last night, was not that good. I'll see you guys tonight for The Mandalorian, and later this week, Super Mario Bros. I haven't seen it yet, but I will. I am so hyped. I cannot wait to see this movie. Take care, y'all. See you soon.